I've been diving into the comics that have come out since the show's end, and, well, they're fantastic. DiMartino still takes creative lead, and well, I've since finished both The Legend of Korra Turf Wars and Ruins of the Empire. I have to say, like the show, they're really quite enjoyable, if notably flawed. As I say in my hefty Korra video, the comic is something the show can never be. Korra is no longer a costly animation airing on the main network that Nickelodeon looms over. Plus, by the time Turf Wars began, it had already been 3 years since the show had ended. Even now, having finished the comics, I can still agree with that impression I had. However, there are familiar limitations that permeate throughout. After all, the structure of the plot is rather similar to the seasonal setup of the show. One conflict and a big bad to take down by the end, with some overarching through lines between. That limitation ends up stymieing the time we have with individual characters and leaving aspects underdeveloped. Even so, they're worth reading. Turf Wars begins with, well, the thing the creators clearly wanted but were not allowed to do. By picking up right where we left off, we immediately get to one of the most important new developments. That being the romantic relationship between Korra and Asami. They get to be what I so often want from romance in fiction, but rarely receive, especially from the creators of Avatar and the many offshoots that the team has gone on to make. The girls are happy, their chemistry is incredibly sweet, and it's not about any strain or conflict between them, which is what writers so often rely on, romances that should end with a breakup given all the conflict along the way, but no, that's not satisfying for the fans, so gotta marry them off, I guess. But with Korra Asami, the romance is earned. What little moments of confusion, miscommunication, or anger between the pair is resolved by them being good partners. Recognizing something is amiss and talking things out, supporting and empathizing. Though the comics let two queer characters simply be in a happy, healthy relationship that doesn't have some sort of tragic fate, it doesn't pretend the world is so welcoming too. Though it's brief, there is a fair deal of nuance to how the many cultures view sexuality. The Air Nomads had a long tradition of accepting all walks of life. The Fire Nation was once the same until Emperor Sozin came to power and declared them to be a criminal act. There's a really great scene after the vacation. Korra excitedly wants her and Asami to go tell her parents that they're together. While Korra confidently reassures Asami they'll be accepting, when they're at the dinner table, she nervously stumbles on her words. But Asami grabs her hand and helps her deliver the news. Senna and Tonraq are happy for them. Though that happiness does get into some trouble when Tonraq expresses caution, claiming the conservative values of the Water Tribe, Korra's headstrong individuality, and her new relationship might cause tension. So maybe it's best to stay private on the matter, which Korra rightfully gets frustrated with before storming out. But even so, it's not the focal point of the story. It's a brief moment of well-intentioned parenting misplacing its concern that ultimately leads to another moment showing how good Asami and Korra are for each other. The comics also lay out how big of a tell the letters were between Korra and Asami. That yeah, writing tons of correspondence to only one person during the lowest emotional point for Korra that she hit through the whole series was a sign. A point of connection deeper than she shared with anyone else. The comics are a bit more explicit about all this. Asami admits to almost confessing in one letter. Korra discusses that their shared nature of being brash and pushing back against what society tells them to be was part of the connection early on. That Asami being the one that was always there for her when she was struggling to recover in Republic City was the moment she realized what she actually meant to her. I believe the show probably would have included some of these details had they been allowed to. Even so, the fact that people interpreted the exchanging of dozens of letters while in the midst of handling deep trauma to just be really close gal pals loops into the whole heteronormative view I talked about in my other video. How other characters viewed the Korra Asami vacation supports that argument. For someone like Bolin or Mako, they see their two friends going on a trip together. Nothing more. For Kaya though, she's able to infer a little more of the truth from such. That's because she knows what it's like to be in a relationship with another woman. In general, there isn't any major character who reacts to this relationship all that poorly. The fallout of the new spirit portal within Republic City becomes a central focus. Its arrival, along with the war against the Earth Empire, has left many displaced. With police and military forces focused on relief efforts, the old triad gangs have taken advantage of the chaos. Then there's the matter of capitalist interests trying to profit from the situation. In the midst of all this, an election is to be held for the presidency, and there is no one to run against the largely disliked incumbent, President Raiko. Despite my earlier complaints of the relative brevity of these two runs, Turf Wars handles all of this plus the interpersonal stuff rather well. I like that this has a kinda back to season 1 vibe, where the big city becomes the major setting and we get to see different parts of it from different perspectives, feeling slightly more critical of stuff it hadn't fully been in the past. We get another peaceful protest being met with force from the government, which does a better job of showing how good-intentioned people in a bad system can end up becoming tools of oppression. Seeing Zhu Li's development is also a highlight, where much of her screen time was shared with Varric and mostly dominated by him up until the very end. She's now the lead in that relationship. Varric is actually not in the comics a whole lot, and has gone from a bossy jerk who undervalues Zhu Li to a supportive husband who recognizes how much she kept his business and him together. Meanwhile, her organizational and management skills have her taking charge over the evacuee situation. She spends much of her days at the camp organizing relief efforts, setting up temporary housing, obtaining supplies, ensuring everyone has access to medical treatment. She's on the ground level keeping things afloat until a long-term solution is formulated. All of this on top of her cool-headed temperament and compassion is making her quite popular with the people of Republic City. So to see this character who is kind of just a bit role throughout most of the show become this major player and really fill that spot so well, I think it kind of addresses one of the big complaints people had with the TV show, that being that a lot of side characters just were that, side characters. They didn't have much going on, but here, Zhu Li totally does. The evacuee camp is also where one of my favorite pages takes place. Upon Korra and Asami's arrival, Korra goes out to speak to the people in hopes of inspiring them a bit. She tells them anything you need, just ask. But this highlights the issue with Republic City's government and their over-reliance on the Avatar. No matter how powerful a person may be, no matter the type of power they wield, they cannot single-handedly solve all the world's problems. That society doesn't need a kind-hearted benefactor, it needs structural change. With just a simple layout, we get all of this in Korra's feelings of being overwhelmed with her responsibilities and desire to help others. With Ruins of the Empire, things kick off with the leftovers of Kuvira's army back in the Earth Kingdom refusing to surrender. The democratic elections that King Wu proposed at the end of Book 4 are about to take place. Meanwhile, Kuvira stands on trial in Republic City, but is then recruited by Korra to head to the Earth Kingdom and get her remaining troops to surrender. However, Commander Guan and his holdouts are not interested in an all-out fight. Instead, he plans to seize more power through the elections. Which is this really interesting setup. What happens when the progressive changes of society are not directly opposed, but co-opted? Why would regular people support someone like Commander Guan? A man who served just another tyrant in a long history of the Earth Kingdom's abusive leaders? And well, the answer is a little disappointing, because they don't actually ask those questions. Turns out his plan is to literally brainwash folks into supporting him. Not through propaganda, but like an actual brainwashing machine. The relationship between Su Yin, Kuvira, and the Beifong family is further explored, which I do appreciate. Kuvira's background is revealed, and we see the fallout of such not on Kuvira the Great Uniter, but just plain old Kuvira. Seeing how she came to be adopted by the Beifongs and what her early life was like in a place where she was the outsider. This is all in an attempt to humanize Kuvira and build towards a redemption arc, which has some issues. I'm not outright opposed to this form of storytelling device. Firstly, there can be so many permutations. Failed redemptions, partial, or just ones that leave matters up in the air, asking questions about the notion of a redemption arc to begin with. Kuvira is a bit messier though. There are some obvious parallels to some very awful real-world figures. So at some point the question is not only asking if Kuvira can be redeemed or forgiven, but maybe those real-world people too. Now they try to get around this by claiming she wasn't fully aware of everything going on in her empire, specifically the work camps. Which, if you believe her, then the negligence is still rather damning, and she commits plenty of heinous acts of her own. The question of redemption in this instance needs to be less black and white, less about resolutions or clear and clean answers. More like this: are future actions of selflessness and kindness irrevocably tainted by heinous acts of the past? Can those motivations of wanting to be better, to put good out into the world, be trusted? Who is this kindness really for? Ruins of the Empire doesn't seem interested in all that, and that's a shame, because these questions can be quite compelling. I believe such informed the writing behind Zuko from The Last Airbender, making him the best character in that entire show. In Red Dead Redemption 2, its protagonist Arthur Morgan is a fantastic example of a good version of this trope. There's a particular mother and son Arthur runs into towards the end of the game that had a small role earlier on. They watched Arthur beat up on the father of the family for some money he owed. Nearly 50 hours later, things have taken a real turn for Arthur and the Vanderlyn gang. This interaction with two peoples whose lives he had thrown into chaos has wrapped back around on him. It becomes about why he seeks to help them. Who is he really doing this for, and does it really even matter? Yes, maybe he wants to ease his conscience as his world falls apart. Maybe he wants to do a good thing less so for the sake of those that are suffering, but to satisfy his own ego. However, does it matter? Should the mother just take the money from Arthur and improve her and her son's lives and accept that the end result is life will be better for it? It's this really great scene where every emotional outcome seems plausible and valid. You could understand if the mother just spat in his face and said she wanted to see Arthur suffer and keep beating himself up over what he had done. Or if Arthur had pulled his revolver and forced the woman to accept the money, breaking down into an emotional mess. That's when redemption arcs are at their best. When they're as messy and conflicted as the people working through them. But how Ruins of the Empire wraps up, it's the complete opposite. Simple, clean, and a big, unsatisfying, warm family hug that fails to fully recognize the damage done or respect those who were on the receiving end. I went back and forth with Ruins of the Empire and its Saturday morning cartoon plot with a bad guy who's bad because he's bad. But then I realized, honestly, a fun adventure romp with Korra and her friends is something I'm more than happy with. I love these characters enough that I don't always need some big political statement or complex emotional catharsis. It's a lot like Mass Effect for me in that way. I like these characters so much that simply spending time with them is reason enough to further engage with anything they're in. I maintain that it would have been better served with more room to tell this story. Another volume or two. That way we could get more Korra and Asami being so perfect for each other, but also have enough space to explore those more interesting questions about political elections and redemption arcs. Given that Ruins of the Empire only wrapped up back in February, and how the team behind Avatar seem more than happy to keep expanding the world through comics and novels, I think we'll see more of Korra sooner rather than later. While I'm okay with more of these stories in the shape of the TV show with plots and villains resolved with each outing, I would also really love a long ongoing comic that gets to have more runway with its ideas, because I think there's a lot left to still explore here in this universe. While 2014 may not seem that long ago, I think in terms of media criticism and the voices in those spaces as well as creating the media in question, we've changed a fair bit, especially in a nerd-adjacent sphere like animation. The Last Airbender and Korra occupy a weird and complex spot in that regard, written largely by folks of non-Asian descent, though the animation studios in Korea were given quite a bit of control too. That setup is kinda similar in the comics so far, with Michael DiMartino now as the sole writer, with the art departments having folks of Asian descent on staff. Irene Ko was the lead artist on Turf Wars and was given free reign to work in her own style, which does a great job complementing the more intimate moments while also being able to adapt and go a little off model for something more evocative at times. And clearly she has a good understanding of martial arts. She also had a voice in other matters too, describing Turf Wars as a collaborative effort. She pushed to have a more diverse display of cultures outside of the familiar influences of Japan, China, the Inuit, Tibetan, and so on from the TV shows. And given Ko is a bi woman, I have to imagine her influence on telling the story about two bi women is partly why Korra and Asami's relationship is so convincing. I've seen something interesting popping up on my Twitter feed as tons of artists do their takes on the cast. Many of these artists being of Asian descent have talked about their redesigns as wanting to make characters look more Asian. Ko also mentioned this in an interview with Comic Book Resource back in 2017. And I think that's interesting. Because my point here being, I think one of the great benefits of these expanded universe-styled offshoots is that they give opportunities for other voices to be heard. I obviously enjoy the work of Bryan Konietzko and Michael DiMartino, but I think it's integral for any expanding franchise to bring in new voices, so that even when the original creators have moved on, we still get to see new stories in the worlds we love, but more importantly, have new life born alongside them, to prevent stagnation, to complement and challenge the established creative powers, to adapt and become something new that better reflects the breadth of beauty humanity has to offer. Well, that should be the end of me talking about Korra for a little while at least. I do really hope that now that it's on Netflix, you go give the show a try. Maybe it's been years since you've done so, maybe you never bothered, but you end up coming away enjoying it and wanting to read these comics. And you should also do this. Donate to my Patreon. For $1 a month, you get your name in the credits as a thank you and access to some bonus posts. Mostly me talking about the anime I'm catching up on from my backlog, or maybe a review I write every now and again for things like a video game or whatever. For $5 a month, you get all that, plus a behind-the-scenes sort of production video for each video. As always, thank you for anyone who has watched to the end, and especially to those who have already donated or just subscribed, because that helps a lot too.